The ride started with casual podcast talk. Joe Rogan was sharing his favorite military stories while the driver politely listened. Then Rogan mentioned the Tora Bora operation, and the driver spoke for the first time. There was snow, a lot of snow. You never mentioned that in your podcast? Rogan paused. How do you know? The driver's answer changed everything. Welcome to The Human Stories. Before we dive into this incredible encounter between one of the world's most famous podcasters and a man whose past he'd been talking about for years, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button. It was 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night in Austin, Texas. Joe Rogan had just finished recording a 3-hour podcast episode about special operations missions, diving deep into declassified Navy SEAL operations and CIA activities in Afghanistan. His brain was still buzzing with the stories he'd researched, the details he'd uncovered, and the respect he felt for these elite warriors. As he walked out of his studio, Rogan pulled out his phone and called an Uber. The ride home usually took 20 minutes, just enough time to decompress after a long recording session. Tonight felt different, though. The military stories were still fresh in his mind. When the black Toyota Camry pulled up, Rogan climbed into the back seat and immediately noticed the driver. Mid-50s, average build, wearing a simple gray polo shirt and baseball cap. Nothing remarkable about him except for his posture. Straight, alert. The kind of bearing that comes from years of discipline. "Evening," the driver said, his voice calm and professional. "Joe Rogan, right? Heading to Bee Cave Road?" "That's right," Rogan replied, settling into the seat. "Thanks for picking me up this late." As they pulled away from the studio, Rogan found himself still energized from the podcast discussion. He'd spent hours talking about Operation Anaconda, the Battle of Tora Bora, and various SEAL team missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. "You ever listen to podcasts?" Rogan asked, making conversation. "Sometimes," the driver replied. "Depends on the topic. I just finished recording one about special operations, Navy SEALs, that kind of thing. Always amazes me what those guys went through." The driver nodded but didn't respond immediately. Rogan continued. "The amount of research that goes into these episodes is incredible. You have to cross-reference multiple sources, verify timelines, make sure you're getting the details right. The Tora Bora operation, for example," Rogan continued, warming to the subject. "December 2001, hunting bin Laden in the White Mountains of Afghanistan. Most people don't realize how complex that operation was. Multiple teams, different agencies, local tribal fighters." The driver listened quietly, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror as Rogan spoke. "What really gets me is the terrain," Rogan went on. "These guys were operating at 10,000 feet, carrying 80-pound packs, hunting the most wanted man in the world through cave systems that had been fortified for decades." Rogan paused, looking out the window at the Austin lights passing by. "I spent weeks researching that operation, talked to a former CIA guy who was there, read every declassified report I could find. The coordination between all those different units, the real-time intelligence gathering, the split-second decisions. The altitude alone would kill most people," Rogan continued. "Thin air, freezing temperatures, and they're carrying full combat loads while tracking targets through terrain that looks like the surface of Mars." The driver remained quiet, but Rogan noticed his hands gripping the steering wheel a bit tighter. "And then there's the human element," Rogan said. "These aren't video game characters. They're real people with families, fears, hopes. They're making life and death decisions while dealing with sleep deprivation, altitude sickness, and the constant threat of enemy contact." They hit a red light, and in the brief pause, the driver finally spoke. "There was snow," he said quietly. "A lot of snow. You never mentioned that in your podcast." Rogan's stream of consciousness stopped abruptly. He leaned forward slightly. "What did you say?" "The snow," the driver repeated, his voice still calm. "Tora Bora, December 2001. There was heavy snow that week. Made everything harder. Movement, visibility, communication. You talk about the altitude and the cold, but you never mention the snow." Rogan felt something shift in his chest. "How do you know that?" The driver met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Because I was there." The car fell silent, except for the hum of the engine. Rogan stared at the back of the driver's head, processing what he'd just heard. "You were... what?" "Tora Bora, December 2001. I was part of the operation." Rogan's mind raced. He'd interviewed dozens of former military personnel over the years, and he'd developed an instinct for recognizing the real ones. Something in this man's voice, his demeanor, the casual way he'd corrected a detail that wasn't in any public report. It felt authentic.
Wait, hold on, Rogan said, his podcaster instincts kicking in.
You're telling me you were actually there? At Tora Bora? The driver nodded slowly. CIA paramilitary. I was attached to a special operations team for the duration of the operation. Rogan felt like he'd just discovered buried treasure. Here was someone who had lived through one of the most significant military operations of the 21st century, and he was driving an Uber in Austin. This is incredible, Rogan said. What are the odds? I just spent 3 hours talking about that operation, and now I'm sitting in a car with someone who was actually there. It happens, the driver said simply. There are more of us around than people think. What's your name? Rogan asked. Mike. Mike Harrison. Mike, I have to ask, what was it really like? The operation, I mean. Mike was quiet for a moment, navigating through a turn. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of memory. Cold, colder than anything you can imagine. The altitude hits you like a sledgehammer, even if you're in good shape. And yes, there was snow, lots of it. Made everything harder, movement, visibility, keeping equipment dry. Rogan listened intently, recognizing the tone of someone who wasn't performing or embellishing, just stating facts. The terrain was worse than the intelligence reports suggested, Mike continued. The cave systems were more extensive, better fortified. We knew bin Laden had been there, but by the time we arrived, he was gone. How long were you there? Rogan asked. 2 weeks. Felt like 2 months. And you were CIA? Paramilitary. I'd been agency for about 6 years at that point. Started military, transitioned to civilian operations. Tora Bora was one of my last assignments before I came back stateside. Rogan shook his head in amazement. I can't believe this. Do you mind if I ask what you did after that? Mike smiled slightly. Couple more years with the agency, then private security, then corporate consulting. Now I drive Uber 3 nights a week and do handyman work during the day. You're kidding me. From hunting bin Laden to driving for Uber? Life has a way of leveling things out, Mike said. Besides, it's honest work, no politics, no bureaucracy. They were approaching Rogan's neighborhood now, but he didn't want the conversation to end. Mike, have you ever thought about telling your story publicly? Mike shook his head. Not really my style. Besides, most of it's still classified. Rogan caught the subtle implication in Mike's words. More complicated how? Mike was quiet for a moment, then spoke carefully. The operations you talk about on your show, they're based on reports, interviews, declassified documents, all legitimate sources, but there's always context that doesn't make it into the official record. Like what? Like the fact that Tora Bora wasn't really about capturing bin Laden. By the time we got there, intelligence already suggested he'd moved on. It was about denying him the use of that base, gathering intelligence on his network. Rogan leaned back in his seat. So, the whole "we almost got him" narrative is partially true. We might have gotten him if we'd moved faster, had better intelligence, but the primary objective was always broader than just one target. Why doesn't that information get out? Mike shrugged. Because we successfully disrupted a terrorist base. Doesn't sound as compelling as we almost caught the world's most wanted man. People want clear heroes and villains, simple victories and defeats. Reality is messier. They pulled into Rogan's driveway, but neither man moved to end the conversation. Mike, do you ever listen to my podcast, the military episodes? Sometimes. You do good research, get most of the facts right, but you're working with incomplete information, and you know it. That's exactly why I need to talk to people like you. Would you consider coming on the show? Mike turned around to face Rogan directly. Mr. Rogan, I appreciate the offer, but I can't do that. Most of my career is still classified, and the parts that aren't would put people at risk. What if we kept it general? Talked about the experience of being in special operations. There are plenty of people who can talk about that. You've had some of them on your show. Rogan nodded. True, but they weren't at Tora Bora. Mike smiled. We weren't hunting bin Laden either. We were doing a job. But that job happened to be one of the most significant counterterrorism operations in history. From the outside, maybe. From the inside, it was just another mission. Cold, difficult, dangerous, but just a mission. Rogan sat back, processing everything he'd heard. Mike, can I ask you something personal? Do you ever regret it? The secrecy? The fact that you can't talk about what you did? Mike considered the question. No. The work we did was important, but it wasn't about recognition. It was about results. Rogan looked at his house, then back at Mike. I feel like I should pay you more than the Uber fare for this conversation. Mike laughed. The fare's fine. Besides, it was good to talk about it. Don't get many opportunities. Really? You don't talk about your service? Who would I talk to? Most people wouldn't understand, and the few who would are dealing with their own stuff. It's easier to just let it be. That seems lonely. Mike shrugged. It's peaceful. There's a difference. Rogan pulled out his phone to rate the ride, then paused. Mike, would you mind if I called you sometime? Not for the show, just to talk. About what? Military stuff, life stuff. I feel like I could learn a lot from you. Mike handed him a business card. That's my handyman business. Feel free to call if you want to talk. You won't mind? I wouldn't have given you the card if I minded. Rogan got out of the car, then leaned down to the driver's window. Mike, how many other Uber drivers in Austin have been on classified operations? Mike smiled. More than you'd think. We're everywhere, Mr. Rogan. We just don't usually announce ourselves. Why did you tell me? Because you were getting some of the details wrong, and it bothered me. Also because you obviously care about getting the story right. As Mike drove away, Rogan stood in his driveway for several minutes, staring at the business card. He'd interviewed Navy SEALs, former CIA agents, military historians, and Pentagon officials. But this 20-minute conversation with an Uber driver had given him more insight than months of research. 3 days later, they met at a coffee shop in South Austin. Mike arrived first, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. Thanks for meeting me, Rogan said. No problem. It's been a while since someone wanted to hear about the actual job, rather than the mythology. For 2 hours, Mike painted a picture of special operations that Rogan had never heard before. The endless waiting, the bureaucratic frustrations, the simple human moments between life and death situations. At Tora Bora, Mike said, we spent most of our time trying to stay warm and coordinate with local fighters. The actual combat was maybe 6 hours spread over 2 weeks. How do you reconcile that with the importance of what you were doing? You don't think about importance during the operation. You think about the guy next to you and getting everyone home safely.
Mike, I want to ask you something,
Rogan said as they finished their coffee. Would you consider being an off-the-record consultant for my military episodes? Not on the show, just helping me understand the context that doesn't make it into official reports? Mike considered the offer. You mean like a fact-checker? More like a reality checker. Mike nodded slowly. I could do that, as long as it stays off the record, and I can decline to comment on anything that's still classified. Absolutely. I just want to get the stories right. These people deserve accurate representation. There's something you should know, Joe. That night in your Uber wasn't an accident. Rogan's eyebrows raised. What do you mean? I listened to your podcast, have for years. I specifically requested rides from your studio because I wanted to meet you. Seriously? You do good work. Your military episodes are some of the most honest mainstream discussions of special operations I've heard. But they could be better with someone who was actually there to provide context. Rogan sat back in his chair. So you engineered our meeting? I positioned myself to be available if the opportunity arose. When you started talking about Tora Bora, I figured it was time to speak up. That's incredible. Why didn't you just reach out directly? Mike shrugged. Cold calls don't work. But a genuine conversation in the back of an Uber? That felt more natural. Well, I'm glad you did. This has been one of the most educational conversations I've had in years. Good. Because there are a lot more stories that need proper context. Mike pulled out his phone and showed Rogan a photo. 8 men in winter gear, standing in snow-covered mountains. This was taken 3 days into Tora Bora. See the guy on the left? That's Martinez. He was killed 6 months later in Iraq. Never got to tell his story. Rogan studied the photo. These are the guys you served with? Some of them. The thing about our work, Joe, is that we didn't just lose people in combat. We lost them to suicide, to addiction, to the weight of carrying secrets they could never share. The real casualty count is much higher than what makes it into official reports. How do you handle that, losing so many people? You find ways to honor their memory. For me, that means making sure their stories are told accurately, even if I can never mention their names. When you talk about these operations on your podcast, you're talking about real people who made real sacrifices. I never thought about it that way. Most people don't. That's why this conversation matters.
Over the following months, Mike became Rogan's unofficial military consultant. He'd listen to episodes before they aired, providing context and corrections when needed. Never on the record, never seeking credit, just ensuring accuracy. The thing people don't understand, Mike told him during one of their regular coffee meetings, is that most of us didn't serve for recognition or glory. We served because the job needed to be done. When we come back to civilian life, we're not looking for parades or thank yous. Even if that means driving Uber? Especially if that means driving Uber. You'd be surprised how many meaningful conversations happen in the back of a car at midnight. People open up, share their problems, their fears. Sometimes being there to listen is just as important as any mission we ran overseas. Rogan began incorporating this perspective into his podcast, speaking about the transition from military to civilian life with a nuance he'd never had before. His military episodes became more human, more real, less about the mythology and more about the people. One evening, Mike called Rogan with an unusual request. "There's someone I want you to meet. Another guy from the old days. He's been following your podcast evolution and wants to share something with you." They met at the same coffee shop where Rogan and Mike had first sat down together. The new guest was introduced only as Tom, a former Delta Force operator who had transitioned to teaching high school history in suburban Austin. "Mike told me about your arrangement," Tom said. "I wanted to add something to the conversation." "What's that?" "The kids I teach today, they're fascinated by military history, but they have no idea what modern warfare actually looks like. They think it's all Call of Duty and Marvel movies. Mike suggested maybe we could help bridge that gap." "How?" Mike leaned forward. "What if we put together a group, former operators who are living civilian lives now? Teachers, mechanics, Uber drivers, small business owners, people who could provide authentic perspectives on different aspects of military service. An informal advisory group?" "Exactly. No publicity, no credit, just people who care about getting the story right." Rogan was intrigued. "How many people are we talking about?" Tom smiled. "You'd be surprised how many of us there are in Austin alone. Former SEALs, Delta, Rangers, CIA, even some people from units you've never heard of. We're all living normal lives now, but we remember what it was like." "And you're all willing to help?" "We're all tired of hearing our stories told wrong," Mike said. "This is our chance to help set the record straight, even if no one ever knows we're doing it." By the end of the meeting, Rogan had agreed to work with what they started calling the Reality Check Group, a rotating collection of former operators who would provide background context for his military content. 1 year later, Rogan was recording another military-themed episode when he received a text from Mike. "Listening to the show. You got it right this time. The snow detail was perfect. The guys are proud of the work we're doing." Rogan smiled during the recording, knowing that somewhere in Austin a network of former operators was quietly ensuring that their brothers' stories were being told with accuracy and respect. The Reality Check Group had grown to include 12 former operators from various backgrounds. They met monthly at different locations around Austin, reviewing Rogan's planned episodes and providing insights that no amount of research could uncover. "You know what I learned from all of this?" Rogan told his audience during a recent episode. "The most important stories are often the ones being lived quietly, right in front of us." Mike went from being a CIA operative to making sure people get home safely at night. Tom went from Delta Force to teaching teenagers about history. The mission is different, but the service continues. Mike never did appear on the podcast. None of the Reality Check Group ever sought public recognition for their contributions. They remained in the background, offering guidance when needed, corrections when necessary, and perspective when Rogan got too caught up in the mythology of special operations.
The real heroes, Mike once told him, are the ones you never hear about. The ones who do the job, go home to their families, and never feel the need to tell anyone about it. They carry their service quietly, like a challenge coin in their pocket. Always there, but not for show. That night in the Uber had started as a chance encounter between a famous podcaster and an anonymous driver. It became something much more valuable, a reminder that extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, and that the most meaningful service often happens without fanfare or recognition. The beauty of Mike's story wasn't just in the classified operations he'd participated in. It was in the quiet dignity with which he'd transitioned from protecting national security to ensuring drunk college students made it home safely. From gathering intelligence in hostile territory to listening to the problems of passengers who just needed someone to care. Every time I get in an Uber now, Rogan told his listeners, I wonder about the driver's story. Every time I meet a teacher, a mechanic, a security guard, I think about what they might have done before this job. Because Mike taught me that heroes don't stop being heroes when they take off the uniform. They just find new ways to serve. The Reality Check group continues to meet monthly. Their influence has spread beyond Rogan's podcast to other content creators who want to tell military stories accurately. They've become a quiet network of truth-tellers, ensuring that the sacrifice and service of their generation is remembered correctly. Some heroes wear uniforms and get medals. Others wear polo shirts and drive night shifts, carrying their brothers' memories with the same dedication they once carried their weapons. The mission continues, just in different forms. Have you ever met someone whose quiet strength changed your perspective? Someone who served without seeking recognition? Share their story in the comments, because the most powerful stories are often the ones that begin with a simple question in the back of an Uber at midnight. Subscribe if you believe these hidden stories deserve to be told. Help us honor those who serve in silence.